Hey everybody! So this is going to be the sort of accompanying longer nerdy, what I'm calling nerdy version of the intro video that I just put out. And I'm just going to basically ramble at you to tell you about additional facts related to the shorter video. So let's get going. First, I wanted to start with just reminding you guys about what the salmon life cycle looks like. I'm pretty sure that most of you have heard about this, or if you grew up here, you definitely learned about it. So it's probably a little redundant, but it's always good to review quickly. So I just pulled up this nice chart by King County, and we'll just go through it real quick. So let's start with the adult salmon that come back into the river that they were born in to lay their eggs. So this is what it says here. Adults return to the stream of their birth to lay the eggs of the next generation before dying. Then those eggs incubate in gravel inside that in that riverbed. Then alevins hatch from the eggs, staying in the gravel until all the nutrients from their yolk sac have been absorbed. So basically they look like this. And I've heard it explained to me like these are their little lunch boxes. So basically your parents leave you with this little lunch box before they die so that you have stuff to eat when you're still like a little baby. So that's what's going on with these alevin. And then they emerge from the gravel after they've used up this yolk sac, this lunch box, and then they come out into the stream and they're called fry. So they're still in the river at this point. Then when they're ready to start going into the ocean, they transition through an estuary, which is kind of salty, kind of fresh. It's a mixing of the two kinds of water. Then they live there until they feel ready and adapted enough to go into the full salt water of the ocean. So after that, as smolts, they go into Puget Sound, and then they eventually go out into the ocean from there, where they get to be big adults. And then they're out in the ocean for 2 to 7 years, depending on the species. And then finally, they make their way back into the river that they were born in. And once they do that, they don't eat anymore. They're just using up their fat reserves to swim upriver. All right, so that's sort of about the life cycle. Now I wanted to tell you guys sort of about what seasons each of these things are happening and where they're happening in our actual local area and in our local streams. So for that, I was going to introduce this concept of RIA, or water resource inventory areas in Washington. So there are 62 of them in Washington, and depending on which one you're in, there's kind of different things going on for salmon recovery, or there's different issues that affect the salmon most in those different areas. So if you go into this statewide RIA Finder map, that'll take you to here. And then I am most familiar with RIA 8, which includes Seattle, Bellevue, Issaquah, Sammamish kind of area, Renton. So really this whole thing is going to really have a bias toward RIA 8 information, maybe some stuff about RIA 9, which includes the Duwamish. So I will give you some examples of where these fish that live in RIA 8 or are from RIA 8 are going and what's happening with them. So this is the official website for kind of RIA 8, 9, 10, and 12, I believe. And so you can go here and learn about a lot of the salmon recovery plans and look at more detailed maps and things like that. So let's look at the RIA 8 information. So RIA 8 is also called Lake Washington Cedar Sammamish Watershed. And let's look at a map, which we kind of already saw before, but this one's nice because you can kind of see what kind of land uses are in RIA 8. And if you go to this website yourself, you'll see that you can hover over this map and click stuff. So you can click, for example, in the area and you'll get more details about what's going on there. And then you can click in kind of like Seattle area and see what's going on there. So yeah, I was going to tell you guys a little bit about the salmon that go through Lake Washington and then into the Cedar River, which is right here, flowing through Renton and then Maple Valley. And then maybe I'll also tell you guys a little bit about the Piper's Creek, kind of Carkeek salmon. So let's jump into Google Earth now and look at where these salmon are swimming, their routes, and when they are, where they are. So let's start with the Cedar River salmon. So Cedar River, the mouth of the Cedar River is at the southern tip of Lake Washington in Renton. And so the river kind of flows like this and then along 169. For a lot of its length, right up against 169 at some spots. And then at around Highway 18, it starts to stop following 169 so much. So it goes down here and then to Landsberg Dam. And then from there, it goes into our Seattle's protected municipal watershed, which that'll be a totally different video and story. But yeah, the river flows through here in this beautiful forested and kind of mountainous area all the way up to Cedar Falls and then Chester Morse Lake. And then from there, there's kind of small headwater streams going up into the mountains somewhere in all these nice forested hills. So the adult salmon coming back to spawn would be using the length of this river that we just traced out to be swimming upriver against the current to find a good place to spawn. And at Landsberg Dam, they start to there's different things that happen depending on the species, but if you're a Chinook, you may be able to go above this dam and use all of this beautiful habitat with nice riverine habitat above there. If you're a sockeye, that's as far as you'll go, but there's a hatchery there. Again, that's a story for another video. But yeah, so that's where you are. And usually the salmon come up the Cedar River in the fall. So with Chinook, they're a little bit earlier, so maybe in September or so. And then with the sockeye, maybe more in October. I've been there in November looking at the river and have seen lots of sockeye then too. So it does go for a little while. So after they lay their, say you're a sockeye that's coming up the cedar in the fall, and then you decide to lay your eggs, I don't know, somewhere over here or something. So you deposit all your eggs in the gravel right here. And then what happens is that they stay in there, those eggs and those little alevins stay in there till about the spring. And then in the spring is when they start emerging as those fry and they start going down the river back out into Lake Washington. And sockeye, some species of sockeye need a lake as part of their life cycle. So these Cedar River sockeye, they are one of those. And so when there are these little baby salmon coming out from the Cedar River, they spend actually 1 or 2 years in Lake Washington before they start then going through Portage Bay and Lake Union and the Ship Canal, and then out into Puget Sound. And then from there, they'll spend some time in Puget Sound and then go out into the ocean and can travel all the way to Alaska or thereabouts, depending on ocean conditions, depending where the food is that they're trying to eat and look for. On their return journey, when they're ready to spawn, they will use their many senses. We actually, interestingly, don't know exactly how salmon find their way back to the stream they were born in, but it seems to have something to do with potentially the sun, magnetic fields, the chemical, like the ability to smell the chemicals and the particular specific scent of the river that they came from. So they'll come back from the ocean, back into Puget Sound, and then down back through the locks. And you guys have probably been to the locks where you're seeing the salmon come through there. That usually happens in the summertime. So those adult salmon are coming in those adult sockeye in, say, June or July or August, and they make it through the locks, back through Ship Canal, back through Lake Union, back through Portage Bay, into Lake Washington, and then again, using that sense of smell, they'll look for their stream that they were born in and go back swimming against the current, and the cycle starts all over again. So that is the Cedar River salmon, sockeye in particular, there that I just talked about. And then another really cool salmon run in the city or in our urban areas is the Carkeek Park chum salmon. And so with these guys, they have a shorter kind of ways to go in order to get to Puget Sound, but they'll come in from Puget Sound, start swimming up Piper's Creek, and then spawn there, and then they come in usually November, with November 15th or so, I've heard, being the peak time. And so if you go out to Carkeek in November, you're going to see some volunteers on the weekends, and you'll be able to see some usually chum salmon. I might do a separate video talking about Piper's Creek chum salmon because they have a really interesting history. They were not here until we basically reintroduced them in the late 70s and early 80s. And it's a really cool restoration and sort of education project with those salmon. We basically wiped them out with railroad and other kinds of development we were doing here that made the salmon lose their habitat back in the late 1920s. So yeah, maybe another video another time, but that's those guys. Oh yeah, so they are in November, and then again in the springtime, those baby chum will go back out to Puget Sound and then to the ocean. So that is sort of an overview of where these salmon are and when in our area. And now for the rest of this rambling video, I am going to talk a little bit about the factors that I purposely didn't talk about in my intro, the short version of the intro video. So there I talked about the 4 primary causes of salmon population declines, and that is because I was more focusing on the causes that are most important right now and that have the biggest effects. But that's not to say that there aren't other factors that are also affecting salmon to a lesser degree or more historically. And so there's a lot of nuance here, but the kind of 3 topics that I was going to touch on for that are predators, artificial light, and fishing. And those are actually kind of all the same thing because they're all kind of about the salmon getting eaten in different ways or for different reasons. So yeah, they could really technically be one additional minor factor, but or not exactly minor when maybe you put them all together, but less important in my view compared to the 4 primary causes that I talked about in the short video. So anyways, again, I have a Raya 8 bias. So there's this really cool report that came out in December 2024 where it was talking about the predation that happens to baby or juvenile salmon in Lake Washington. And so in Lake Washington, so there's a lot of things that eat salmon, like everything loves to eat salmon. You go out in the ocean, there's like marine mammals and bigger fish and sharks and everything, and orcas, of course, and they all love salmon. This thing when I say predators is excluding humans because I'll get to humans when I talk about fishing, but with the predators, there's also some invasive species that are starting to be more of a problem. So in Lake Washington, there are a lot of invasive fish that are starting to do even better as the waters get warmer. So they do better when the water is hot, and salmon do worse when the water is hot. So it's getting to be a bigger and bigger problem. So there's a lot of research being done by Department of Fish and Wildlife in partnership with, USGS or NOAA, whoever, to figure out what to do about this. So yeah, in Lake Washington, research and monitoring conducted over the past decade indicates that predation by non-native fish species and northern pike minnow is limiting survival for juvenile salmon. So again, remember when I told you about how the baby salmon come through Lake Washington before they go out to Puget Sound in the ocean? This is when they're getting eaten a lot by these non-native or invasive fish species. Climate change and continued illegal introductions of predator fish such as walleye and northern pike exacerbate the predation problem. And so I guess I will just kind of tell you about the key takeaways that I thought were interesting from this study, which was really cool. But basically, one way that they tried to get rid of more of these invasive fish is by making it so that you can fish more of them recreationally. And so in 2020, they made some rules where you could fish more of them. And this study basically showed that didn't really help very much. So the recreational fishing rules implemented in 2020 do not appear to have affected the abundance of largemouth or smallmouth bass in Lake Washington. Other non-native fish species that prey on juvenile salmon, including yellow perch, rock bass, and black crappie, do not appear to have been affected by the 2020 recreational fish rules. So basically, it's finding that environmental factors like climate change are having a stronger influence, increasing the abundance of those predator fish species like faster than we can fish them recreationally, basically. And they're going to continue to be a threat. And so basically, we should do a program where we directly remove these invasive fish that eat the baby salmon a lot, instead of maybe just allowing more recreational fishing on them. So that would be like if the government had a program to basically get rid of these fish in some way. So yeah, predation is not a, non-trivial part of the salmon population declines, but if we had all of those other 4 primary causes I mentioned in the shorter video solved, this wouldn't be very big of an issue, in my opinion. And I would say that the research bears that out so far. And related to that, there's also this artificial light problem. So artificial light at night. So here's a picture of Lake Washington at dusk. And basically you can see that there's a lot of light getting into the waters of Lake Washington. And this is both from, direct light being right on the water, as well as sort of the effect, like the sky glow effect, from lights both near and further away. And so the interesting thing about this is I really like this picture, maybe because it's really nerdy, but so what we're looking at here is basically how far a predator trying to eat baby salmon can see at different times of the day. So during the day, they can see obviously a lot further, and then that also depends on depth. So as you go down deeper, you also can't see as far. But when it gets to nighttime, you basically can't see very well at all, normally, if there's no artificial light. So the problem when there is artificial light at night is that these predator fish can see the baby salmon to be able to hunt and eat them more than they normally would, because normally, without the artificial light at night, there's really only dawn and dusk times, low light times, that these, a few hours a day, that the predator fish can get the salmon. And that's because the baby salmon can also see, and they can kind of outsee those bigger fish that are trying to eat them during the day, so they can run away. But at dusk, that's when those predator fish have the advantage, dawn and dusk. And at night, they should not be able to see them basically at all. But because of the artificial light at night, it kind of turns it into dusk-like conditions throughout the entire night. And that just gives so much more time for these baby salmon to get eaten and their numbers to be reduced. I thought this was really cool. This person made a map, preliminary results of the relative surface light level in Lake Washington. So you can kind of see the places where it's darker or lighter. So there's a nice dark patch here, but looks like over by Madison Valley area, or Madison Park area, sorry. It's pretty bright, so there's probably some things that could be done to help that. And then there's some light down at the southern tip of Lake Washington as well. So in reading, there was this cool report about artificial lighting impacts to salmon in Riot 8. And I liked the sort of summary recommendations they had for helping with this issue. So, only use light if it's needed. Use shielding and shaping to direct light only where it's needed. Use active controls, timers, motion detectors to use light only when it's needed. Minimize brightness to light. Minimize blue-rich lighting, because blue light turns out to be able to penetrate the water much deeper and more strongly than other colors. So using warm colored lights also helps. And this is if you are, closer to the shore, especially, or like you have a house on the water or something. But this also matters for sky glow from light sources that are, further away from the water that still make it to the water via that indirect scattering. So then the last thing I was going to talk about was fishing. Turns out that's also just another form of predation, but by humans, which we then call fishing. So this topic is a little bit nuanced and complicated. Maybe isn't that straightforward or easy to talk about, but there are certain species in particular that are threatened by overfishing. I would say that in general, those 4 primary causes that I mentioned in the short intro video are much more important, but there are, again, specific species that you definitely want to avoid eating to help them recover better. And I know some people who work in salmon recovery, for example, who basically just don't eat Chinook or king salmon because they really just want to leave them in the ocean for orcas. And that makes sense. So maybe it may make more sense if you want to eat salmon to eat pink or chum or coho or sockeye. And in addition to that, there are also sort of more specific stocks that you can look out for and make sure that you aren't eating or fishing for. And the way that you can kind of check that is you can go to NOAA Fisheries Status of Stocks report and look for those yourself. So the most recent one is from 2023, so they usually release it the year after for the previous year. Maybe the 2024 one would have come out already if the government wasn't shut down, but I'm not really sure. 2023 is the most recent one that I could find. So if you look at this, you can see, and by the way, I'll put links to all of these websites that I'm showing in the description of the video. So yeah, if you look at, right here, can I make this bigger? Yeah, okay. So you can look at the overfishing and overfished stocks as of December 31, 2023. And here, if we look in the Pacific, we can see that Chinook salmon for the fall Chinook in the Klamath River. Sorry, I didn't really mention this before, but even within a single river and single species, you can have different runs. So for example, you can have spring Chinook, summer Chinook, fall Chinook. and they're all assessed kind of separately. So that's why this line here is saying it's the fall Chinook that are on the overfished list in the Pacific. And then there's Washington Coast, Queets, Spring Summer Chinook, and then Queets coho salmon. So yeah, really want to make sure that we aren't fishing those any more than we are now, or actually to reduce the amount of fishing pressure that we have on them. And there's this kind of nuanced distinction between what overfished and overfishing means. If I was trying to explain it simply, overfishing is when you are fishing the species faster than they can replenish themselves, but it's not quite as bad as if they're overfished, because if they're overfished, it means it kind of already went past that limit for a while. And so it's kind of a worse state than overfishing, but it also means that they may be affected by other things. And so, for example, if there's a lot of habitat loss, they could be overfished given that habitat loss. So, yeah, so those are some examples there. Another important thing to note about fishing or overfishing is that it was truly more of a historical problem. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s was when overfishing was really the biggest problem. And now we've moved more into a regime in modern times where a lot of those other primary causes that I already mentioned, again, in that short version of the intro video, those are really the factors that are limiting population recoveries and not so much overfishing. For example, in Lake Washington and for the Cedar River sockeye that I already told you about, there hasn't been a fishery on those fish for, I think, almost 20 years now. But despite that, their populations are crashing pretty hard. So yeah, there's just other more important factors now. And another thing I want to note on that is that you can sustainably fish salmon even in really large amounts. And the indigenous people here went before we had a lot of habitat degradation and those other primary causes I mentioned in the short video, we're doing that. And so I think I wanted to show you guys just a little bit about that. So Indian bands and villages along Pacific Northwest rivers were heavily dependent on salmon, which provided the largest single source of protein in the Aboriginal diet. The technologies and practices of Indian fisheries were effective, with Indian harvests fully comparable, I never really know how to say that, fully comparable to the industrial fishery during its heyday between 1883 and 1919. So a lot of salmon were being taken out, but that was okay because the populations were so healthy and they were being sustainably harvested. Another really cool piece of history here. In 1940, these researchers estimated the catch at 18 million pounds per year. That was in the Columbia River Basin, or more than half the size of the commercial harvest in 1933, which was 26 million pounds. The Indian harvest, before the first contact with Europeans, was a very significant proportion of the commercial catch of the modern era. They based their estimate on a population of 50,000 and a consumption of 1 pound of salmon per day. Another researcher used a larger estimate of the population, and accounting for wastage, they estimated that a Columbia River annual catch was about 23 million pounds, which made the indigenous fishery about the same size as the fishery of the 1940s. Then later estimates in the 1980s with different population consumption estimates were even higher, 41 million pounds. And that would have made that indigenous fishery fully comparable to the industrial fishery, again, during its heyday between 1883 and 1919, which surpassed 41 million pounds only 9 times. So we're talking about just huge amounts of salmon that were in these streams, and they could easily bounce back if we recover their habitat, slow climate change, improve the water quality, and then we'd be able to fish them more than we do today. So that's why overfishing and fishing is a little bit tricky to talk about. I'm sure there's more we could say here, so let me know if you have questions or other cool statistics or stuff that you want to share. I think that wraps up everything I wanted to go over for this nerdy version of the intro video. And also the sun is going down, so it's probably going to get too dark in here. And also, Katie Wilson just became mayor-elect of Seattle, so I'm going to go and celebrate. Bye, y'all!